Good afternoon. I guess even those of you who come from places where alcohol is forbidden, you will know about hangovers, particularly if you've come to London. And those of us who come from the culture here certainly know about hangovers. But really I'm using it not just as a sort of easy laugh to refer to things remembered, but in a sense to describe my memories of the very infrequent occasions when I've had a hangover, that you recall the events of the night before in a sort of mixture of accurate memory and inaccurate memory. Sometimes you even sort of remember things that didn't really happen. And you remember them in a rather unbalanced range. And I wanted to draw an analogy between that and architecture. If you will remember that my fundamental theme is to do with the fact that I believe that there is so much to be talked about and thought about and used by architects that comes from within the architectural culture itself. In other words, that although it is expected of architectural academies and enjoyed by many, that a lot of the discussion is about philosophies, is about cultural issues, political issues, reading texts, dismembering texts, discussing abstractions, discussing mathematics, but that I have the fear that in many conditions, architecture is almost the last thing that is talked about, even though it's supposed to be the thing that most of you sitting in this room will spend a large part of your life involved in. In other words, it almost many teachers and intellectuals that hang around architects are sort of almost embarrassed by it, as if it's some sort of slightly dirty business, like, you know, having a bath or something that you do, but you keep quiet about it because it's slightly. And I take the completely opposite view, and the longer I spend in and around architecture schools, the more I take the opposite view, which is that architecture contains within it almost every aspect of deceit, intrigue, intelligence, layered intelligence, operation, technique, and, if you wish it, roots towards abstraction. That it's so wonderful, it's so weird, and it's so perverse that I felt that in the 6 lectures that I'm doing, of which this is the last of the first 3, as you know, that I'm trying to sit within architecture and occasionally stick a sort of finger out sideways from it and say, well, maybe this tells you about human nature, or this tells you about funny things that happened in history, or this tells you about the relationship between opportunity and psychology. But the architecture is the center. And here is a collage made by an old Danish professor, Niels Ole Lund, who I was told yesterday, since I was passing through there, that he's still around, still has a room in his old university, comes in with his cigar, and has, I'm told, the best collection of pornography on that part of Denmark. I've never actually seen it. But he had a penchant, and still has, I believe, for making these architectural collages. If you look carefully at the collage, you will find an extraordinary combination of different points of origin, all welded into one. And in a sense, I thought that was a very useful starter, because it's as if Niels Ole has been having a sort of hangover for the last 70 years, and enjoying it, of course, as he seems to. In a sense, the hangover from architecture has now become a commodity. you can go to Las Vegas and have all the architecture you need all in one block, pretty much. You don't have to bother to go to New York. You don't have to bother to go to Paris and a number of other places. It's all there in a sort of almost polystyrene conglomerate, 3/4 scale or half scale, it doesn't matter. And so it can be on offer as a commodity, just like anything else, which I always find amusing. Why bother more? Everybody can have a bit of architecture and a bit of culture. It therefore makes the sort of niceties of discussion as to whether Adolf Loos was reappropriating certain aspects of neoclassicism to one end or to another, and to what extent he was a craftsman as well. It makes that all seem very small fry. It makes it all seem very, very arch and very particular and very sort of Viennese and so on, in relation to the styrene city. It makes the issue of Richard Meyer's debt to Le Corbusier, in a sense, retreat into being architects' discussion about the niceties. You can argue that who the hell cares who he was influenced by if the resulting building is a good one? And in fact, very little architecture comes from comes from under a stone. We're all influenced, and if we have our eyes, if we're interested in what we see, you only have to go from here to Tottenham Court Road Station, and you've got a lot of architectural ideas. They might be 15th rate, but there's some architecture out there. Even the hole in the wall, even the hole that they've taken out at the corner by the side of the Dominion Cinema, I find fascinating. I wonder how many of you have looked at that hole. I know that corner for the last 40-odd years, probably longer. But now they've taken the building away, there's something very strange going on the top of the Dominion. Have you noticed? There's a secret, yes, somebody's nodding, somebody's looking. That's good. Watch that lady, she's looking at things. And there's a strange chamber up there that must have been up there for a very long time, has now been revealed. I don't know whether anybody knows what to do with it, but it's there. And to me, that's architecture too. Architecture doesn't have to just be done by a famous architect, although most of the stuff I and others showed you is. But that whole, that seductive, tantalizing piece of London space up there has also architectural potential and tells you a lot about the way in which things, or at least leaves you with a puzzle as to the way in which things happen in a three-dimensional city, because if anywhere that particular little piece of London is highly three-dimensional, if you took a section through that bit of London, you would find that Tottenham Court Road and all station and all its machinations and the hidden sewage lines and all the various things that must be passing, and the fact that for once in London you have a fairly tall building right alongside it. If you drew if you drew a section through that piece of London, it would be a fantastic building, of which that chamber up there is only one little piece. So one can suggest that what I pointed out last week about Meyer being very, very influenced by Le Corbusier is probably only really somebody with a passion to allow him to be that overt and with the talent to do it rather well. I think that Meyer is a very good architect, currently unfashionable because he's been around for a while and he's no longer trendy. And one has to be careful about that. I can remember when I was a student here, there was a man called Paolo Soleri. Some of you may have even heard of him, and he's still alive, who had so many people wanting to come to his lecture at the AA that the AA had to rent the hall around the corner in the TUC building, which seats 1,000 people. And even then, people were being turned away at the door. The last time I saw Paolo Soleri, which was at a Biennale about 3 years ago in Venice, there were two people who noticed that he was there. No lecture, no audience. Two people. He was just a little man in a hat doing some concrete blocks. Now, maybe his legitimate reputation lies somewhere between the 1,000 plus and the two guys. But we have to be careful about the cycles of fashion. I think it will be appreciated probably in 10, 15, 20 years' time that Meyer wasn't too bad actually and had a few ideas. Perhaps the fact that he chose a certain language is another issue, that there are languages that go in and out of fashion. There are languages sometimes that take a long time to come back because they can be seen to have inappropriateness here or there. And that therefore the ideas are sometimes dissipated by the interpretive language. But that's probably cause for another lecture. So that if we are interested in these things, we can look carefully at the language used by Richard Meyer or the language used by Terragni and say, well, let's pick it piece by piece by piece. Who is better with windows? Who is better with corners? Who is better with tops? Who is better with balconies? But Terragni has significance for people who are interested in certain political positions and certain kinds of attitudes towards orthodoxy. So probably the smart thing this week, this year, in this place is to say that Terragni is a significant architect and Meyer is just some schmuck North American. Whereas I would submit that actually Meyer is the better architect from where I come from. Though Terragni appeals to the purists, but I don't think he does so much that's that interesting with it. But this is a personal view. It's interesting, and I suppose the best source of discussion for this is the famous book by Rainer Banham, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, which discusses the significance of classicism vis-a-vis the work of Mies van der Rohe. And it's interesting to look at something like the Kröller-Müller house in relation to the birth pangs of asymmetry and modernist asymmetry, modernist asymmetrical organization, vis-a-vis the hangovers of classical organization. This building is awkwardly trying not to be balancedly neoclassical, but it hasn't really gone on the turn yet either. And so this is a case where one has a case of birthright or looking over the shoulder, a hangover of one infiltrating the next. It's rather like, if I use the alcoholic analogy, going to a meeting with the hangover and you haven't really come out of the Alka-Seltzer hasn't taken root and you're a bit bug-eyed in the meeting and it's still coming out as a bit daft. By the time of the Tugendhat house, a certain sort of compositional series of operations has actually taken over, and the building therefore is able to relax in its distribution of parts, and in the process of relaxing actually becomes far more interesting. I might have said this to you in the last 2 weeks, I can't remember, but one of the problems that one has as a student who has things thrown at you, very hot and solid. I can remember various groups of students that I've taken to Los Angeles, since it's my favorite other town, and I can't even remember which group it was, whether they came from this place or the Bartlett or or Frankfurt, and sometimes there have been combinations. Anyhow, one group I was out in LA with had heard a lot about Frank Gehry, heard a lot about Morphosis in the early days and so on. And having heard all this, kept pointing to something up on the top of a hill and said, yes, but what's that? What's that? What's that? And then one very bright guy had actually been up there in his own car and said, it's this bloke called Lautner. You know, he's really interesting. And the whole group then, irrespective of how much they'd heard about the other people, they really wanted to know about this bloke that they hadn't been told anything about. And I can remember myself that I had Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier rammed into my head for so long that, as I think I said to you last week, that once I was photographed standing in front of the IIT building, I was bored out of my mind, but I had to have the photograph just to prove that I'd sort of, you know, been to church, as it were. And it was only later, when I was with one of the many groups of students, that I was, in the same year, visiting the rebuilt Barcelona Pavilion, and this house, the Tugendhat house in Brno, I realized that there was another Mies, a completely different sort of Mies van der Rohe, from that which had been rammed down my throat. But I had to discover it myself 30 or whatever years later. So don't listen to us guys, go and find it and follow your own enthusiasms, I suppose, is a subplot here. Now, the modernist disposition of parts has continued to be attractive in many places, and I thought this was an amusing one because it's in a sort of less talked about place. It's actually quite a recent set of housing in Tallinn, Estonia, done about 3 or 4 years ago by somebody who you may or may not be familiar with, called Emil Erbel. Watch that space. Looks pretty interesting. Probably would look less interesting if it wasn't coloured, and might look less interesting if we could see an aerial view of the plan. But nonetheless, the modernist sort of clothing and gestures towards this sort of non-classical planning has got quite a lot of mileage in it. And in revival circumstances such as this, it can provide at least what appears at distance to be an agreeable suburban architecture, quite tight suburban architecture. When I came to the school as a provincial student, that is to say somebody who'd done 3 years in an English provincial school, I was quite young and quite spotty, and was treated by the in-house AA people as some, you know, like most provincials at the time, as some sort of something just about above what the cat brought in. And I had been reading about what went on in there. I'd been devouring certain selected pages of the Architectural Review. I'd been watching the front pages of AD magazine as described in that room, and knew about the Smithsons quite a lot. I would follow every newspaper cutting I could possibly find about the Smithsons, and was delighted when eventually I became Peter Smithson's student. But I jumped. I was shocked because there were some people also from Bournemouth already at this school, and they said, oh, we'll take you along. The first day I was here, we'll take you along to a lecture. Everybody's going to it. And I thought, it's going to be something really, really, you know, right up there among wild, modern. It was about Voisey, you know, the English arts and crafts stuff. I thought, this is a bloody AA, you know, I come from the English provinces, I know about brickwork. You know, we had lots of lectures about brickwork. I thought, I haven't come here to see this. The next day or the day after, I went to a lecture by a man who I had also as a provincial admired fantastically, called Edoardo Palozzi. He was, to my mind, a very important British artist. And it was down in the basement, in a room I don't think is used, I don't quite know what it's used for right now, part of the print room or something. And there was an audience of 6 people. of whom I was one. And Palozzi showed 450 slides of Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and sort of rubberware and all sorts of interesting things. That's what I'd come to the A to know about. But what I'd missed was that the rather smart set had moved on, or moved backwards or sideways, or God knows where they'd moved, and they were talking about Voisey, the English arts and crafts situation, which I suppose subconsciously, having been brought up in a number of English provincial places, I was trying to escape from. I'd lived in Letchworth for a couple of years. You know, I'd lived in English suburban parts, and hipped roofs and dormers and all that stuff. Not I necessarily lived in a house as elegant as this one. And in fact, this one is a German house. This is the Germans doing the English thing, because it's actually by the guy I was talking about last week, Ulbrich, doing a workers' house for the Opel company. So this whole thing of hangovers is very intriguing, that you have to watch. When you catch the spirit of the moment, God knows what the spirit of that actual moment will be. It might be a mixture, and of course, handled by rather good architects, it can deceive you, because a very good architect will make something good of whatever mannerism, whatever moment of conscious revival or looking over their shoulder, will still do it better than somebody not so good doing something that you enjoy. And I found also as a teacher that I've often been more attracted and more interested by people who don't remotely do what I do, but are very interesting about how they do what they do, than somebody who just sort of watches what you publish and then tries to do the same thing. I've never been very interested in that. You know, you probably do it better than they can anyhow, so why fuss about? I'm not great on the sort of acolyte thing. It's very interesting to see here, again we're back to Darmstadt, at the foot of that tower with the upstretched hand, where the same Peter Behrens is starting to make architecture for the first time, using, again, the mannerisms of the day, but using them quite oddly, because after all he was an artist by training rather than an architect. The Hangovers backwards, Ulbrich, who of course was a much more facile and developed architect, could play further away from the norm. He didn't have to use the hip roofs and so on in quite such a stiff way. He was, in a sense, making a house that had half an eye back towards the rather larger buildings that he was then making, and used surface decoration as quite a conscious thing. And this is also Ulbrich with a slightly more three-dimensional house, where he's looking, in a sense, I suppose, at certain sort of romantic German traditions. It's quite interesting, isn't it, that in children's books, particularly sort of related to fairy tales, funny, spooky things happening up in the forest, the mountain, Grimm's fairy tales, etc., etc., houses with odd, lost pieces of roof, balconies upon which she can stand and throw a flower, odd staircases that disappear into the bowels, deep porches that are almost buildings in themselves, are almost ready for the theatre, that the house becomes a kind of statement of theatre. And even a house for a sort of, let's say, more or less parallel socioeconomic conditions, such as Boyce's house back in Bedford Park, there is an element of sort of British Puritanism. It is special, and it is delicate, and it is sweet, but it is also very complete. Is there something that one might observe here about the underlying culture of the North that says, yes, it can be decorative, it can be delicate and so on, but it must be complete and sensible? I'm not sure, it might just be on a different budget. And Boise allows himself to spread but there is still, even the reentrant parts are relatively shallow. And this looking back to the past, this looking back to this romantic period, a mysterious romantic period of sort of, educated peasants, or God knows what they were, is very odd when it's combined with other factors. I think this is a particularly hilarious building because it's got a bit of everything. It's got bits of sort of industrial architecture, almost borrowed from maybe the United States or borrowed from Germany. It's got bits of British tradition, little remnants of neoclassicism, and then some sort of bits that aren't quite sure what they're trying to be, but they give them a Gothic top just to calm it down, or not calm it down. Eclecticism is supposed to be a dirty word where I come from. I'm not quite sure where I do come from, but in all the different circumstances of architecture that I have come from, eclecticism has always been a sort of pejorative term. But it's fascinating to observe. It's fascinating to see what the hell was going on in that guy's head, or was it done by 6 people? I can remember having a bunch of students from Frankfurt who all seemed to go and work in Stuttgart for Banish, for Old Man Banish. And they used to report back, they used to say, God, Banish office is a really good office to work in. He lets you do your thing. He lets everybody do their thing. And then they started building the post office museum in Frankfurt next door to where I was working. And you could tell it was done by about 11 people, all having a wonderful time. But it was really sort of like, I've sometimes associated with a wonderful band called the Portsmouth Sinfonietta, which played classical music so badly you could hardly recognize the original. But everybody was having a good time. So if you said, I want to play the tuba, they sat you down apparently, and you played the tuba, and somebody else said, I want to play the violin, but you weren't necessarily playing what the bloke next to you was playing. But they had a wonderful time. And so I think buildings like this are fascinating because it's having a lovely time, but whether, Mac on the top was telling Joe on the floor below what he was actually up to, and then Joe says, fuck, how am I going to sort that out? There's this thing coming down, we've got to move it over there. So then Fred, who's a friend of Joe, enjoys himself. That's a good opportunity to put one of those windows in. They're very fashionable this year. And if you enjoy architecture, you have a wonderful time till they all find out. And now this is so famous that you can also, of course, go back to your hometown, like my friends Gertz and Gabi in Frankfurt, and keep the building within the profile of the old little town. That doesn't say you don't do naughty things once you've kept the profile, but you kept the profile. That is the profile we have kept. And then you stick the thing up. Well, here's a nice one. I find fascinating. This is Terunobu Fujimori, as you well know, who is an interesting man because apparently, so it says on Google, he goes around Europe and other places collecting the sort of selected vernacular. And certainly there are a few bits and pieces of even this that have a faint sort of memory if you are English provincial. There's I always think, a wonderful loop between the English and the Japanese. I can see there's some Japanese sitting here. My observation of my Japanese friends, when you get to know them, is that they're the only other nation that is as silly as the English, that makes silly jokes, that likes gossip, that likes toys, that likes making funny noises and sounds, and are completely bonkers when they've had a couple of drinks. But even without a couple of drinks, they're often quite bonkers. They are very, very similar to the English. There are not many English sitting here, you see, so you can't check. But they really are, and they both come from damp islands that have moored off the coast of the mainland from which officially the culture came, and have totally perverted the culture just as the English don't really have a head for solid philosophies and so on, and correctness, as soon as the English architect starts to know how to do a certain sort of thing, they get a bit bored with it. Okay, done that, been there. I wonder what we could do if we sort of did something. And I read the same. I read the same psychology in Japan, and many, many years ago when I first went there, I said it, but it's just the same. Narrow roads, daft people, and lots of interesting, funny conversation. I mean, as you get to know more of them, I'm digressing. So that I think I have met Fujimori somewhere a long time ago in a meeting somewhere, but I sort of feel that I know him. I sort of know where it's coming from. I'm just waiting. I'm sure there are English Fujimoris out there who go and collect funny bits and pieces and say, well, that could grow on top of there, and then this is this, and it looks a bit, but it looks like a face, but it looks like a shirt, but actually the technical part of it is very well done. You see, that's also a similarity. Interest in, you know, well, that corner could be quite something. I fear this is going to be a slightly longer lecture than, last time. So when we have an expatriate Czechoslovak, such as Jan Kaplitzky, who comes and lands in England, he lands with his own view of the high tech and the results that he's developed from this period. It's an early one of his, where it's still a sort of conglomerate, it's just a piece of Meccano. He's now cleaned up his act, of course. But I'm fascinated by he has a romantic view of the setting. I'm not quite sure whether the setting is somewhere in Austria or further east, doesn't really matter. He's landed his object there, but he enjoys the romantic condition in order to land the object, and on the object he lands another technical object. So you've got the helicopter landing on the vehicle landing on the land. And I think in this way, and he's talked and written about these things, he also carries many wish dreams coming from the fact that he actually did make a very small piece of building before he ever escaped from Czechoslovakia, and was very aware of us lot when he landed here. And I like to make a sort of connection between David's version of his landed object. This is a rather late painting of the pod landing in the idyllic landscape. It's rather in the way that Jan's pod lands in the idyllic landscape. But in fact, David is closely on record, and I remember at the time that David Green's real first inspiration was from this endless house of Kiesler. And that actually, as one comes round, and I think this has got to wait for another lecture too, but the significance of Kiesler as the almost undiscovered person until recent years, and the range of Kiesler's ideas. What's interesting about Kiesler, having recently seen the Kiesler archive in Vienna, is that he did a lot of terrible, terrible drawings, really shockers, but he had, and a few good ones, but he wasn't a great drawer. But my God, he had an enormous number of ideas, and composite ideas, and sort of ideas that weren't even consistent with each other, compounded together in a single project. Absolutely fascinating mind. I think he's somebody whose reputation is not overrated, although I used to think it was before I saw the collection. And a guy, I've lost the captions who it was, but this is also a sort of weird, what is he looking at? What is he remembering? Particularly since he's a Swiss. Think about that. This is from Switzerland, guys. How does he escape without being locked up? We wonder. But, of course, there have been people doing things like that. Herb Green, in a more kind of open-minded condition of Oklahoma, made this very famous house all of 40 years ago, the Chicken Shack house. maybe the Swiss guy was looking over his shoulders. And there are certain architects who can take themselves with them. This is the first major building done by Peter Wilson and his wife Julia Bolles. They won the competition in Münster, and they built this library. And Peter had developed a fantastic reputation in this place, in the AA, or in the period leading up to that, in the period from the 80s and the early 90s, more or less the 80s in London. And then they won the competition. They moved to Münster. They've stayed there. They've done a number of buildings since. But this was the one that was closest to the sort of thing that he was doing with his students. It's more or less a real, very AA project of that period, a very P. Wilson project. Their later buildings have become more circumspect, have become more regular, still good, actually, still rather good, but not anything like as funky as this must have been as it landed in the middle of Münster, which, as you can see, is a pretty ordinary town. And the Hangovers. There is an extraordinary house. Sorry, it's a crappy picture, but it's an extraordinary house done for a doctor somewhere in Upper Austria by a couple of guys, which was Grüngross and Richter, the key guy being Helmut Richter, who recently retired in Vienna. And if you want to read more about what I think about him, I wrote it up last month in the Architectural Review. This house hit a small coterie of people across the world with an extraordinary one saw this somewhere in a magazine and said, "What the hell is that?" Really weird, strange thing which was sort of part high-tech and part loose and part I don't mean loose, I mean loose in the sense of loose, and bits of tenting, and it curved, and it sat on a hill. It was real weird shit. I mean, I don't know, maybe for you it sort of looks fairly normal now, but the number of projects, the number of Japanese architects and English architects and American architects, and my wife, who was sitting still in those days out in Tel Aviv just starting to do architecture, she recalled how people saw this from that and wondered what the hell it was and where it was. And it seemed to have no relation to anything. It was just a brilliant piece. You then discover on looking at his work that actually it had been developing for a long time through his work at UCLA, through his teaching in Paris, through small things. He came originally from Graz, but it was a crazy little old house. And I recently met the client at this retirement party in Vienna, and he said it's been wonderful. He said Helmut came and extended the house, and my practice has doubled, says the doctor. He says it hasn't put people off. It's actually been immensely successful, just as a doctor's house and surgery. But the combination of mannerisms, I think it's a warning, because you have to be a very, very good architect to pull it off. And Richter is a very, very good architect, extremely tough with his detailing, extremely inventive. He's done other houses, slightly less total, but he's also done some marvelous social housing. But there was another famous house which I saw exposed for the first time, probably at about that date, maybe a couple of years later, brought here by Zaha Hadid, actually. She'd met Stanley Seitovitz somewhere in the States and invited him to the AA. This very, very young guy, and I think he was 23 years old when he designed that and built it in the middle of the Transvaal before leaving South Africa. He's, for many years now, been a professor at Berkeley, the only decent thing at Berkeley, as far as I know. but it was a stunningly original house, and that sort of roof subsequently, for some reason, became known as the AA roof. There was a whole wave of people who started doing these, and of course you guys in Japan picked it up. You know, it became and the interesting thing about the actual building, I couldn't find a picture of the built building, though it is built, is that it used South African sort of farm building techniques, rather in the way that Merkert and his friends use them in Australia. There's a sort of South African version of the Australian thing. But I think that this formalistically is an extraordinary house. So whether something was in the air between these guys, there was something, I sort of half checked it out. I don't think they remotely knew each other. But there was something in the air about the relaxed house, the thing of drifting materials over, of allowing the interstitial space to sort itself out as almost as best can. Very extraordinary moment in house design. And if we lurch forward to the work of somebody like Markus Novak, in a way, I think, though the techniques used for making this drawing, of course, are what usually interests people about Novak, he's also no slouch as a building designer. And yet, it really lurches back to that period around 1980 when those experiments were being made. We move forward from Novak again to Lars Spoybrook, Knox. We find that has given meat to the digitally generated work, or digitally generated and then edited work, so that we see that, in a sense, people like Richter and Seitovitz were probably waiting, had they been of a slightly later generation, waiting for this to happen. Although actually, thinking about it, Spoybrook's not that much younger than Seitovitz, but it's people at different places, different times. I mean, you know, Richter's been building, Spoybrook's been building. It gets complicated. Let's leave that one. One of the other then, now just like the hangover, as I came in on, just like the hangover, you wake up with the hangover and you have sort of remembered thoughts of the night before. There's a bit of a conversation here, and then a bit of a giggle there, and then somebody else came into the bar and introduced another conversation. You can't remember whether it was the bloke with the beard or the girl with the hat, but somebody said something, and it all gets, you wake up, it's all a bit bleary. And I think this lecture sort of starts getting like that. It's sort of, there's a purposefulness talking about looking back over your shoulder at certain things. But what's interesting about the Spoybrook building, which I've introduced to amplify this folding, loose folding architecture, is actually the plan. Because the plan is quite circumspect, and it reminds me in a drunken way of Mies van der Rohe again, in another moment. We look at the right-hand one in particular. That's also lurching around. It must have been every bit as shocking at the moment at which it was first published, albeit we can rationalize it back. Yes, it's a high-rise office building with 2 towers with elevators in it and the stairs. Okay, but my God, what is it doing? And so there's been a sort of subplot lasting from the 1920s right through to now about loose architecture, loose, not loose. But then there have been other subplots about technical architecture, the correct route through people like Jean Prouvé, and the more privately developed route, again looking at Helmut Richter, because the same Helmut Richter, when getting larger building, this is his glass school in Vienna, makes extremely beautiful glass-clad corner staircases. Extremely beautiful. Crap slide, but beautiful staircase. go see better than slide. Well, where did we see that? But wait a minute. Ah, of course. The Fargus factory. Gropius and his friends. The extremely beautiful corner glass staircase. Is that some funny subplot that there are very few really good staircases? There were in certain Baroque conditions, but not so many. It's a little sub-tradition. A more known tradition, I suppose, is that of the effect of the constructivists. And here we have to look no further than Paris, as you well know. Bernard, who probably didn't show this 10 days ago, but nonetheless knows it very well. Looking perhaps at things like this, stage design by Popova. I had to put Popova up there on the caption to remind myself who it was. It wasn't one of the people I was more familiar with. And other aspects of the Russian achievement, very much discussed at the time by English critics who didn't know quite how to handle the material in any other way, was the fact that Sterling and Gowan's Leicester engineering building must have been looking at the Russians. Looks a bit of an obvious explanation now, and I think the influences upon them and the development was much more complex. But nonetheless, because this, at the time when it hit, and I think I'm still a student, or I just finished, it was so shocking and weird and original and different to hit Middle England that the famous explainers of everything had to look somewhere, and they said, Russia, Russia. Yes, must be Russia. So beware of the easy explanation. Beware of anything that I say, by the way, by definition. Sometimes when making a building, and I'm pleased to be able to say this building is now coming out of the ground in Madrid. And there is one aspect which I want to just mention, or two aspects. One is that at the bottom, one was very aware of the particularity of the very high column, the high, thin column that raises itself, raises the building well away, unnecessarily far away from the ground, because I've always loved this next building, which is Niemeyer working with Le Corbusier in Rio de Janeiro, when it was still the capital of Brazil, the education ministry. This wonderful elongated column, and one held that as one idea, and then used it as the parent for another idea, which, as some of you know already, is a great enjoyment of mine, which is the sort of non-building building, or the temporary building, or the kiosk, the caravan. That all stems back from Archigram days, where we were much more interested in little bits and pieces that could be manipulated than bloody great solid buildings. And if one follows that, you start to combine them, because in fact what one did was to take one love and stick it underneath the other, or stick it inside the other love. There's Niemeyer's columns, there's the love of the kiosk and the come and go part, and you stick the one in the other and you're in business. I hope they'll enjoy it. So, moving on that train of thought is, how much culture is represented by little things that we dismiss. If you're in Brighton, you have one kind of level of interpretation of a quick coffee and the thing scoots off as a motorbike. If you're in Clerkenwell, where we have our office, life is a little bit more sophisticated than in Brighton, and it has slightly more types of coffee, the same basic vehicle, but now it has become an enclosure. It has an enclosure as well. And a statement has been made, Mr. Coffee, he's so frothy, I'm sure. And if we are in New York, I think this is, we have a different kind of culture represented in the mobile. these mobiles tell you a lot about people. If we are in Los Angeles, certainly this picture tells you a lot about the people, why they kind of are, more about the people than the vehicle, really, but it's all architecture. It is all architecture. And here's a particular favourite of mine. In the 1920s and 30s, the notion was that you established boulevards. You would flank the boulevards by villas. You would have trees so that you could walk the dog, and it could crap happily along the route. And then at the end would be a kiosk. This happens to be Frankfurt, happens to be Holbeinstrasse. Holbein being a famous artist, as you know. So we have Hans Holbein. What the bloke is doing, I always like what people are doing. What the hell is he doing? That's to be minor competition to decide what he's actually doing. Or we have the version in Tel Aviv. Interesting that in a town that is thought of as having a more difficult time than Frankfurt, the guy looks much more pleased. The guy looked miserable as hell in the Frankfurt version, and the kiosk, which is almost identical to this, except the other one is wooden, but the pattern of the kiosk is exactly, and it is in a boulevard, which has the same trees, the same crapping dogs. And this one's selling bananas at the end of it, and fruit juice. Mums and kids, large queue. And interestingly, we can even trace its role in the scheme of things. This is it's not strictly speaking the same boulevard as in the last slide, but it's the next one along the street, which is Rothschild Boulevard. So it's interesting, it tells you about culture, that the person to be admired was the Baron Rothschild in Tel Aviv. The man to be admired was the painter Holbein. From then on, it's the same difference. It's exactly the same trees, same dog, somebody selling something, same curb corner, same party. I love things like that. So there you were. There they were, these great believers going around the world, doing their boulevards, putting their kiosk up the end. And then the local culture takes over. My hope in Madrid is that we do our thing, and though we're a group of Brits taking our architecture to Madrid, from then on we hope that the Madridois will do their thing. I'm interested, since one has this notion of the container and then you allow extraordinary things to happen within it, I'm very attracted by this project, which is by Preston Scott Cohen, who I find a bit of a bore as a person, but an extremely good architect. And there he is, dropping his things within. But then I was reminded of something. I thought, what does that remind me of? In the American culture, it is Louise Nevelson's pieces of sculpture many years ago, the boxes with the things hanging within. And then to jump back to Preston Scott Cohen, no, I'm not. I'm reminding us that in fact there have been other devices that have a similar proposition, such as what you do inside a ship. But then to Scott Cohen, where he drops in his toroidal architecture very selected pieces that kind of inhabit the otherwise organized, simple space. And he's very good at it. Reiser and Umamoto, who in other conditions I find very interesting architects, also from New York, are not quite as good at doing it. We all have our own traditions. We bring ourselves with us. We have the hangovers of what we had before and what we know. And when Christine Hawley and I made a canteen in a building that we were working in often, which is the academy in Frankfurt, the Stadelschule, asked to place the canteen in, we brought the architecture that we knew, the metal and glass, tightened guy ropes architecture, and one made it flap. so that it could be nice in the hot weather. But then one actually brought a personal memory, because in the Archigram times one made things flap. So it was just continuing the flapping. One had one's own hangover. One has a delight in the memory of the 19th century vegetation in Germany, and one brings the vegetation into a project, the veg house. One has the memory of the English allotments. This one is very near here, actually. It's just up in the housing estate, which is to the east of Regent's Park. And if you walk through, you suddenly discover this very developed area of allotments, but unlike the edge of town versions, it's surrounded by quite high density housing. So it's a secret pocket of veggie in the middle of London housing estate. And one appropriates that, one then starts to think of the idea of housing that not only has vegetation as part of its growth, as part of itself, but also the differentiation between allotment, that is deliberately planted vegetation, organized orchard vegetation, hydroponic vegetation, vegetation as part of the housing, and then housing folded into lower vegetation. So it's a sort of flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop. You hang the veg from the building, you put the building under veg, you hang the veg in the sky, you put the building in the sky. In other words, you keep turning the proposition. And in detail, as I said before, one uses those old English terms. In a project done as part of HOK, it's enjoyable for me to remember that HOK is paying for these lectures and is actually sometimes paying for me. And we did this as a project within the HOK office, where one again was playing a certain overlay of the memories of this part of London, which is Southampton Row, and the memories of education, and the memories of the garden. And the garden, in a sense, which conceptually we brought into the building by layering it above the suggested auditoria and eating away part of the building so it would hang around of that, drifting the building down in amongst that. But also memories of a place that one knows quite well as a teaching instrument. What hangs over is what you know of the situation. This is the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris, and its drifted piece of the core of the building is actually the hidden bar under there, and this sort of internal terracing, which is the core of the actual architecture school. Only a few more. I think it will be this one. No, it's not that one. Since we're talking about education, because that last project was a project for the London School of Economics, which we didn't win. In fact, Nicholas Grimshaw won it. But one was talking about the notion of education happening around a sort of disorder existing within order. Here, of course, is a building for education done by the famous president architect, Thomas Jefferson, who laid out the University of Virginia as a piece of classical calm for learning. And it's a very elegant layout, which raises in my mind the question about America and classicism. my own feeling is that the United States has never really been able to rid itself of neoclassicism, that in fact at the beginning of the 20th century, still and well into it, the brightest and the most privileged who wished to be architects were sent to Paris, to the École des Beaux-Arts, and that even in something in the foreground here, you see the Rockefeller Center, which in many ways is the most elegant and agreeable piece of New York urbanism. But it is still basically a classical organization. It's at about the stage of dismembering of the classical that I was suggesting that the Kröller-Müller house was. And it's interesting that it fits as such into the fundamentally classical organization of Manhattan, which allows romanticism but in a contained place. Central Park can be romantic, but then the grid takes over. And I think there is this fundamental problem, and we see it in the organization of Canary Wharf, after all, which is largely influenced by America. It's really an American setup that happens to be in a piece of London. And you see again that the primary instigator is a neoclassic attitude to urbanism. And the docks were very handy. And my God, you even see it creeping during the dreaded period of Dr. Stimmen. You see it creeping into Berlin, which just shouldn't be that sort of city, but it is. These buildings are by Hans Kohlhoff, and we're trying to bring, to me, almost sort of fascistic city back to Berlin. Thank God there are some people in New York who don't think that way. And though these sorts of drawings are usually used to illustrate aspects of digital development, I find them interesting as conglomerate, as the idea of urbanism as a conglomerate, as a collage. And after all, I would enjoy that, wouldn't I? Because I come from that background too. Though my means were different, the instincts, I think, in many ways were very similar. Now, one can use the term hangover in a completely different way. I've been using it so far as the drift of idea from one moment to the next. But it can simply be hanging over, hanging something over. I like the way that sometimes I say, that definition was useful, but I got a bit, I'm English, remember? I got bored with that. Let's just think about something that hangs. Completely different. There's a wonderful building in Buenos Aires that just hangs. Here is a view upwards of the intersection of 4 buildings in the banking district, and 3 of them are sort of older ones. One of them is a newer one, not very new anymore. The bottom right is the one, if you look carefully, there's something strange happening. Something is hanging. That big concrete slab is hanging. Bit of a strange thing to do. But the result of that hanging is extraordinary. The spatial condition within that room is a magic, theatric, layered space. It's one of the best pieces of layering I've ever seen. And the atmosphere within the room, unlike the normal boring banking hall, it's an extraordinary feeling of space and light, and you almost don't quite know where the room ends. In fact, in some ways, the room ends at the building across the street. It has a most extraordinary optical effect, which of course was quite anticipated by Clorindo Testa, who is the architect. It is in fact the Bank of London and South America, which designed as the Bank of London and South America. Now it's an insurance building, but still in pretty good condition. And the building as a whole would be pretty stunning. But there on the right, you see this extraordinary hanger, this wonderful eyelid. And we carry also the vision of certain extraordinary buildings. I think those of us who are English and have a sensibility towards our own culture must treat this as a most important building, of equal importance to Tester's Bank in its way. They're just, my book, there are about a dozen buildings that one would do almost anything to see again, any excuse to go and look. Buenos Aires is a bit further than Kew Gardens, but they're both worth a visit. Here, the dream of the North European for the sun and what it means is although Tester was born in Italy technically, he's essentially a South American, dreaming of retreating from the sun for a few moments. In his building here, we dream of the sun, and I think there is a direct follow-through of this notion of the marble skin building to one of the best moments of the work of the Foster Office, which is to be found in Norwich, as in fact the Sainsbury Centre. The dream of the sun, even at night. But we still carry tradition with us. In England, it's very difficult to get far from the notion that buildings should be solid and stolid and reasonable and circumspect. Or they take their knickers off. Maybe you want to keep it. And suddenly there's a piece of constructivism sitting underneath it. This is like the dream of last night. Like the hangover person, what the hell happened last night? Somebody lost their knickers. My God. But they still had their head held high, as does this building. And where have I seen that done before? I've seen it done with Chernikov. He enjoyed that kind of thing. He had a great time with that kind of thing. Lisitsky had a great time with that kind of thing. Didn't build it. Those guys would have loved the thing down by Baker Street Station. They would have really had a good time looking at that. Quite odd, because a funny thing happened about a year ago. David Green and I were asked by Nigel Coates to give a thing about Archigram. And we'd both packaged our own pictures and hadn't talked to each other much before the evening. We both showed our pictures and we'd both got the Baker Street sequence. Unwitting, now that tells you something about something. The fact that we both live within reasonable proximity of Baker Street might be something to do with it, but I don't think it's a real explanation. Things are sometimes in the air, like both metaphorically and literally. Things are attempted to be in the air. And I think that when some of you guys get bored with doing this, which some of you sooner or later will do, you'll come back to looking at this stuff, because it's also quite an interesting kind of vibe. And if you take yourself with you, you look for stuff that reminds you of what you like. It's like a kid going into a sweet shop and looking for the jelly babies, even if they're in Lithuania. They'll still look for the jelly babies if they can find them, because that's what they like. And I think architects do just the same. And this particular one has particular vibrations for me. One I can remember as a fifth-year student in this school, where I and about 4 other people would go upstairs to a lady who ran the library at that time, called Elizabeth Dixon, and she had a key to a cupboard which might still be there. By the way, look for the cupboard. There's a sort of brown cupboard somewhere in a corridor. I think it's still there. Might well still be there. If you have the key, there is an original edition of Chernikov's 101 Fantasies up there, which hasn't been sold. And it was, and this little coterie of 3 or 4 people, we would ask if we could see it. It was like seeing some sort of pornographic thing. About twice in the 5th year, we went up there and asked Elizabeth if we could have if she could open it up. We would sit until the Japanese then reproduced it in poorly coloured illustrations, and then architectural design reproduced it again in even worse coloured illustrations. So you have to see the original. Yes, what must I have been hung over with was that. There's no question, I admit it. Fair cop. Yes, yes. I wanted to do one. Didn't sort of sit down with Colin and say, I want to do that thing what Chernikov's done. But it was there. It was in one's blood. It was in one's back pocket. It was. I hadn't recovered from that hangover. Nor had this building recovered from the fact that Sharon was brought up in Bremen, and Bremen is a town of ships. And the whole link between ships and boats in the English case, but ships and ships' superstructure was something that I guess as an early 20th century person, or even a mid-20th century person, he had to cling on to remind you that architecture didn't just have to be foursquare and keep circumspectly to its envelope. It could actually enjoy horizontality and enjoy space. This isn't a brilliant example. It's anyone I could find that was near to what I wanted. If you look closer at Chernikov, if you look at more Chernikov stuff, there were even more outrageous and extraordinary, wonderful things, which I have no doubt, in fact I know, Zaha is well aware of. If you look at a selected territory of Zaha's work, you can find that the other bits of Chernikov are still perhaps mulling around in the heads of those who make them. I'm finishing with something that I probably was going to talk about when I was starting to prepare this lecture, but I decided to talk about it a bit more because it is a project that we've just finished 3 weeks ago for a competition, a theatre in the north of Italy by Lake Maggiore. And we won the competition a few days ago, and I can't resist showing you my postcards, as it were. And it, I suppose, is full of hangovers. Nothing comes from under a stone. It is a municipal theatre with restaurants and terraces and places to drink and a gallery and a bookstore. And it sits in the corner of a town square where there is a sort of dirty old river. The nearest thing there to a freeway. In other words, the bum end of the town is that side. The more attractive end of the town is this side. There's a connection through to another town square, and an older town square here. Is this so that one's picked up on that axis, pulled the axis up onto the terracing, made one's own sort of enclave in the corner. And of course, some of my own hangovers come from previous projects. This is one I did many years ago with Christine Hawley, also in the corner of an old town, with an acknowledgement of the town square to the top of the drawing, and a sort of funny, crappy territory which is used for car parks and backyards of funny little buildings. And one made the building have the necessary pomposity to the neat square and necessary dégagé nature to the loose square. One is actually operating, talking back to the town, as I would claim that this building also does, hugging and then releasing and manoeuvring its way vis-a-vis the existing higgledy-piggledy town. And so in Verbania, which is the name of this town, we drop things down, we bring people across, we bring the small-scale activities. Maybe that's a subplot too. The hangover one has is to deal with the major activity and the minor. This is one of the the distance there. And we'll use the local terracotta in some way. We'll sit against the wild part behind the freeway, gaunt, almost like an industrial building, the theatre part. And then we'll open out and loosen and relax towards the market. And we'll have a boardwalk, which is where the sort of the coffee drinkers and wine imbibers of the town will hang out, because one's very realistic that a small town with a theatre isn't going to have theatrical, it's not going to be like standing in Shaftesbury Avenue, you know. It's going to occasionally have something on. That really the building will be used to bring the town, to give something to the town. And I'm delighted to say some of the people who worked on the project are sitting in the room, and I would like to thank them yet again. This is with the roof off. The terracing forms a sort of loose open-air theatre. The restaurants then fall above that and behind it, and then one gets the main group of the main theatre, the fly tower, the dressing rooms and rehearsal areas, and then a small auditorium, bottom right of the drawing. And, waiting for it, quite know why it hasn't, oh yes, the next one's and you see this all organised in plan with the terraces, various, and in my drawing of sections and talking about it, one is always thinking of what you see from within, the business of looking over the heads or shoulders of people, the way that one composes by imagining conditions. The biggest theatre activity, I think, in any, the same actually applied to the Art Museum in Graz, which is that the biggest activity in such towns is actually people going there to be seen and to meet people. By the way, somebody's singing in that big room. By the way, in Graz, somebody famous has brought some artwork from America. But actually, they go there to see people and to be seen and to hang out. That's what these buildings are about. And I'm not a deep cynic to say that. It is a simply observation of what really goes on. And their contribution to the town is the important thing, including the funny little villa, which you see. It has to be part of the scheme because that is the old trade union house. And that is very important in the tradition of the town. Okay. Then there are other hangovers. I know subconsciously I'm thinking of this room in Helsinki. I'm thinking of what you see, and for me, the personal enjoyment is always the section. The section is the key to the whole thing. It records what you see pictorially and also deals with organization. And really the whole story of the whole building is told in that one drawing. And the hangovers are there somewhere, even the ones which aren't quite like any building, I know, but you know what you feel it ought to be like, and that must have come from somewhere. It must have come from something. And the big challenge, just as it is for a very young architect, but the big challenge for somebody who doesn't build that often, is to try to resist putting every idea you've ever had and every memory that you've ever carried into a single building, particularly a relatively modest-sized building. But I'm not going to end up on my own work. I just thought, that's a funny one. What do we say about that? Now I've lost my crib sheet that even tells me what the name of the guy is, because I've never heard of him before. And it's some spook out there in Hungary who's done this building for wine. Here's the crib sheet. I didn't know who he was either, and that's the whole point. That's the whole point. We depend incredibly upon these hangovers and memories and so on. But sometimes it's very important to be surprised and shocked. What the fuck is that? Who the hell is... Oh, wait, I got the wrong week. Name and address supplied, as they say. No, I found it. Name and address supplied. Yes, who the hell? Hands up if there's anybody here, unless they were very avid, astute readers of 2 issues ago, or 3 issues ago, Architectural Design, who has heard of Stadelschule Eckler? Gotcha. But got me as well. I'd never heard of bloody Stadelschule Eckler. I don't know whether he's sort of dwarf, male, female, or sideways. But I suggest to Brett that we should bring him over and see what makes him tick. Mind you, there's some funny things going on. There's a bit of a memory of HOK, one of its worst moments in Finchley Road. Here, we're looking carefully. There's obviously a bit of Imre Makovich there, who's a weird old character. But there's something about it. I think, that's interesting. That's a funny thing to do. Yeah. And I haven't been drinking. Thank you.